Hello, and welcome to the 2023 Dynamic Range Day first webcast. I'm going to be doing 3 live streams throughout the day, or that's the plan anyway. So there's this one where I'm going to be talking in a minute to Mike Senior, who many of you will know from Sound on Sound magazine or the Cambridge MT website, and fantastic collection of mix files that you can download to experiment with. And also now, at my request, Mike has added some unmastered files as well, so that people can practice their mastering skills, which is a fantastic resource. We're going to be talking about the loudness war and dynamic range in general, and how we see this thing progressing, how it's affected Mike and his work over recent years. So that's this stream. Then at 3 p.m. UK time, I'm going to be investigating the idea that people keep telling me, oh, if you make your music super loud, it doesn't matter that it gets reduced in level on Spotify or YouTube or wherever, it's still going to sound louder than everything else. And I want to dig into that a little bit and see. I'll say up front, that's not my experience. There are certain examples where that can be true, but it's not a recipe for success. You're not going to achieve a great sound online simply by pushing the levels as hard as you possibly can. So I'm going to be looking to that in more detail and showing an example at 3 o'clock today. And then in the evening, there is the traditional main Dynamic Range Day live stream at 10:30 p.m. where UK time, that is. For all of these live streams, if you aren't sure what the time is wherever you are, you can head over to dynamicrangeday.com and click the live button at the top. That will take you to a page with all of these live streams. And if you click through to YouTube, it will give you a countdown timer to when it goes live to make sure you don't miss it. So that's the live streams. And then, of course, there will be activity on social media. I'm going to be putting together some more memes. I have more Star Wars memes. People have been loving I'm going to have to leave The Mandalorian at this point and move out into the wider Star Wars universe. But we have some other memes. And I'm going to be sharing various bits of content that are relevant and useful, hopefully, to people thinking about dynamics and loudness and how they want to approach it. So please join in, reshare the content from there, or if you've got something of your own, a particularly dynamic song that you think sounds fantastic, or maybe the opposite. I try and keep things positive on the official end of things, but if you guys want to have a moan about an album that was ruined for you by excessive loudness, I can't stop you. Just try and generate some activity, share the word, get more people aware of these issues. And before I go any further, please, if you are watching this somewhere where you can reshare it, and you think other people would be interested in taking a look at this live stream or the Dynamic Range Day event in general, then please share it and give us a plug to help bring some more people in. You can leave comments on YouTube and in Facebook. If you click through to YouTube, if you're not there already, there should be a chat window to the right-hand side of the window where you can leave messages, which I can see here, at least when I put my glasses on, I'll be able to. Thanks for being here. Thanks for your support. And I hope you enjoy what we've got here today. So I'm going to bring in Mike. Welcome, sir. Thank you for being here.
You're very welcome. Great to see you again, Ian.
It's always great to see you. And as I said there, actually, before we get into this, let me just head over to YouTube and double check that people can see what's happening. Usually this is seamless, but it would be sod's law. This will be the one occasion that it can't. It's not working. Let's just check this. Usually this is seamless, but I think that proves that it's working. Good.
You sound twice as good in duplicate.
Well, I'm repeating myself. Oh, we got some people now while I've got my glasses on. DM, greetings from Berlin. Super Agent AB says.
Just around the corner.
Oh, yeah, right. Super Agent AB says, I'm intrigued to know what that means. Peter says that your volume is a little bit low, Mike. Maybe you should tweak that up slightly.
Okay. Yep, I can certainly do that.
Yep, DMs is working fine. Strafaria. as always, we've got people from, well, we probably don't have anybody from America yet. It's a little bit early there, but they'll be joining us later in the day. So, yeah, Mike, thank you for being here. And I mean, I thought I'd just kind of kick things off. I mean, I have an opinion, a feeling about how this is all going. Yeah, I mean, this is the 12th year, maybe, or 13th year that I've run the event. And when I started out,
God, time flies.
I know, right? It really has. It was
Wow.
2010 was 2010 was the first online version in the sense that the first year I had it was just everybody typing in all caps all day. Which is the online equivalent of shouting.
Dynamic
right?
range. I mean, the irony there is extraordinary.
Well, this is the thing. The idea was that we would annoy everybody and they'd say, why are you doing this? And then we'd explain and they'd understand. What happened was that it just annoyed everybody and we didn't get the message out at all. So we've revised that in recent years. But yeah, so it's been that long. And, what has changed for me is that the issue is very much a part of the mainstream now. 2008 was Death Magnetic with Metallica and that kind of kicked it all off. And now everybody knows about the Loudness War. Everybody understands or is aware of loudness normalization. And what's frustrating for me is
they can take a big kind of slice of the credit for that. I mean, you've certainly been banging on this drum with tremendous dynamics for a long time. And I mean, I've seen you at shows. I mean, the Dynamic Range Day thing, the meter that's been out there. I mean, you've been doing lots of like media appearances just in the general sense. I think this has got to take a good deal of credit for pushing this thing forward.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think banging on about it is probably the right phrase. I guess what's frustrating for me is that from where I am, it feels like people know about it and not many people are doing what I consider to be the logical thing, which is to master with more dynamics. I'm still seeing.
I think I definitely agree with you on this. I mean, the technology is there. The streaming platforms are all using it, but a large number of commercial releases are still being smashed into the end stops, and a lot of people are still fighting the loudness war that's kind of, in some respects, gone away. I mean, I think there are reasons you can have for it, but yeah, it feels like haven't we had this battle already? Why are we still doing this?
Yeah, that's exactly my feeling about it because I mean, there are still some places like SoundCloud and Bandcamp where there isn't any loudness normalization. So in that sense, the war is still in full effect there. If loudness is important to you, you still have to make stuff super loud. But whenever I look, the popularity of songs in those places seems to have no, you literally look at the top 50 and the first track could be 10 dBs louder than the second one. And that just tells me that the people listening to the music, the people we care about, don't care about loudness. And almost everywhere else, they don't hear it that way anyway. The loud stuff is reduced in level. Even if somebody buys a CD these days, the first thing you do is adjust the loudness, as we always. So yeah, it's frustrating. So how does that?
Surely, don't you have your CD changer now? I mean, where have they gone?
You're right. It's in the cupboard over there.
I'm using it as a multiple cup holder now.
Well, exactly. I mean, we joke about that, but of course, shuffle on phones and media players is the replacement for that. And if somebody disables loudness normalization, then that's going to have an impact on them. They're going to hear big changes.
Drive them absolutely nuts.
It is going to. Well, it is, and the other thing is that these days it's on by default on almost all of these devices. And especially because most people. I mean, I have. I still have some CDs. I have more in boxes up in the roof. But even stuff that I've got on CD these days, I just listen to on Apple Music for the convenience. And because I like switching between stereo and Atmos mixes, where there's a big difference in loudness, I have Soundcheck on all the time, and it's on by default, and it's on Spotify, and it's on all the online streaming sites. So most people are listening to CD changers, but they're CD changers with loudness normalization enabled. So anyway, most people watching this are well aware of all of this, and we're preaching to the choir. So I wanted to move it ahead by kind of asking you how is it working for you in terms of the people coming to you for help with their mixes or to actually do some mixing for them or some mastering. Are you finding people are still really worried about loudness, or has that changed at all?
Well, because I'm not so much in the mastering space and I'm more in the mixing space, loudness is almost never. I'm trying to think if I've ever had anyone say anything about loudness. I don't think I ever have. It's
Really?
never
Oh,
been an issue. But
that's
I think, but it's kind of the mechanics of what you need to do to deliver a product as a mix engineer. I think loudness has always been a factor there, even if it's an unmentioned factor. You know, I mean, if we kind of rewind 10, 15 years, you know, you had to realize that if you sent a mix off, that it's quite possible it could be compared under conditions that are not loudness match, and that you might be find yourself in a loudness shootout with someone else mixing it, or with some other rough mix that they have, or whatever, you know, and that because people weren't sufficiently informed about that will be an issue. And it's weird because yes, I think people are more informed these days, but in terms of mixing stuff, because you have no idea how your client is gonna play something, you know, whether if they just get an MP3 file or whatever through whatever form you send them a file, because you don't know how they're going to compare. You've kind of got to hedge your bets a bit. And so I still, when I send out kind of listening versions to people for mixes, I'll take a judgment about, okay, what do I think is a kind of a market loudness for this, and I'll make sure that I send them that listening version at a market loudness, if only so that they can get an idea if they're gonna go with that kind of loudness, the kinds of they're listening within the context of the side effects of that. But I think the biggest impact that I've seen in terms of the mixing process is that now I think you'd be crazy not to be, when you're referencing things, not to be doing a loudness match reference as well as maybe a peak reference as well. I mean, this
right.
is, I mean, for years and years, I've been mix referencing at roughly the same loudness, using loudness processing on my rough version of the mix or my work in progress version to get an idea of how it compares to other stuff. But now you've also got to say, okay, well, I kind of eyeballed that before and just made sure that I was at the same peak level. Now I've got to actually think, okay, how will this go into like the LUFS loudness detection thing? How's my mix going to respond to that? Because it's not always entirely intuitive. You know, if you just kind of earball it, you know, eyeball it, and try and kind of match the fader so it sounds roughly the same loudness between your mix and someone else's, and then you run it through the actual spec, sometimes your mix will actually come back quieter or louder than you expected it to be. It'll seem a little bit subjectively louder, or a little bit subjectively quieter than you thought it was, just because of the differences between the way that kind of K-weighted windowed system assesses how loud your mix is and how you do in your particular monitoring environment and for your particular hearing and preferences and whatever else. So I think that's an extra stage now. That's where I notice it most. Is that now whenever I mix something, I'm also having to go through this little extra step of going, okay, how does this match up in terms of loudness match listening? Because the reality is most of the comparisons people are going to make when the thing's actually uploaded are going to be under those conditions. So you've got this,
Yeah,
you have to kind of hedge your bets for both worlds now.
it's interesting, actually, to sort of unpick a few of the things you said there, because that's less my experience. I find that LUFS tends to correlate pretty well with the way that I listen, but I'm always listening to stuff after mastering. And part of the mastering process for me is, that is matching the dynamics and taking that kind of overall view. So I just wonder, I've not really thought about it before, but I wonder whether, because I hear other people being much more critical of LUFS. I mean, LUFS is not perfect. It's good. It does a decent job. And in particular, if you have two exactly the same files and they just have a loudness difference, if you match those, it's going to be perfect, because it's comparing the same material. But even with sort of, I'd say it works pretty well on 80 to 90% of material maybe, and then there are some outliers but those are always things where I listen and go, well, actually that mix is not completely balanced. But again, I'm coming at it from a mastering perspective where I spend my whole time balancing mixes and things. What I'm saying is I think there's probably more variety in unmastered songs perhaps than in mastered material. So that would kind of emphasize for you the deficiencies in LUFS perhaps. But
Yes, I
it's
mean a little bit. I kind of notice it a little bit in terms of just that certain mixes that get released are just a bit weird sounding, and because they're a bit weird sounding, or they've just got a weird balance. That's the nature of the track. I mean, certainly in pop, it's the old adage: it's more important to be new than to be good. And so you'll get these kind of extreme balances, and suddenly you'll get something that just seems to sound a bit louder or a bit whatever for whatever reason.
mm,
And the yeah, it's just it's a weird situation. It depends a huge amount as well on what the bass response of your listening system is as well,
right,
because of course the K-weighting thing is so much less sensitive for the low end. The amount of low
right,
end you decide to put on your mix can make a
yeah.
big difference in terms of how loud it feels within a certain context. I mean, the thing is
Well,
with the K-weighting stuff is that inevitably in any real listening environment, whatever listening system you're listening through will tend to over or underemphasize certain areas of the frequency response compared to some kind of notional linear listening environment. And so the same going on a kind of a theoretical loudness match won't make up for the fact that maybe there's masses of 3K coming out of that listening system. And so if a mix has a bit more 3K, even though they on a linear system they would sound the same loudness, on a system that has masses of 3K, one may sound much louder than the other. I mean, in a sense, it's an extension of the same mix translation issues that we've often dealt with as mix engineers by using an orotone or whatever, of thinking about, okay, I might have this mix that sounds great, but when I have it on a small speaker that only gives me a small amount of the range, am I still going to sound as punchy or as loud as whatever else on their AM radio or whatever?
well, it's really interesting because mastering is all about translation. Mastering is all about
Yes.
exactly this thing. And one of the misconceptions is that mastering will make it sound good on any playback system. And I always say that's not the case. Mastering will make it sound as expected on any mastering system, right? So, two favorite examples are, I haven't got my pair, the old Apple earbuds, not the new AirPods, but the old ones with wires.
Yeah.
Very tinny, hardly any real bass, not really any super high end, quite a kind of like the NS10 of earbuds, it may be.
Yeah.
Whereas a pair of Beats headphones has this big boost down at sort of 100,
Yeah.
200 region. So they have this very thick, warm sound. So you have kind of two extremes. And obviously, if you tried to EQ a pair of Apple earbuds to sound like a pair of Beats, that's never going to work. But what you can do is you can get the EQ so that when somebody hears it on earbuds, it sounds entirely appropriate for the material. And it also
Yeah.
sounds entirely appropriate for the material when you listen on Beats. So, I mean, and just to pick up on your example, for me as a mastering engineer, if something had a ton of 3K as opposed to anything else, that's exactly the kind of thing that I would be evening out. I would pull it back so that there's enough of it that you listen to it and go, okay, somebody's going for that very aggressive, mid-rangey sound. I want to keep that quality, but I'm going to find a balance where it's no longer painful, and it will translate better as a result for that very reason. Whereas if you played the original on a system that had a ton of 3K, it would be ridiculous. But also, if you played it on something that had lots more bass, then maybe it wouldn't cut through in the way that they wanted. So, yeah, I mean, well, I mean, you were talking various points about the K-weighting, and some people may not.
Yeah.
It's something that I haven't talked about before. So you actually have quite a nice graph that displays that. I can see there's lots of comments. I can't read them at the moment because I don't have my glasses, but I'll come to those shortly. People watching.
To give a bit of perspective on this, or a bit of context on this, I have a site where I do pretty much weekly critiques of commercial releases, and I've been doing this for 12 13 years, something like that. There are like 600 of them up there now, and this was one I did on that Morgan Wallen record from a couple of years back, and this is the song "You Proof," and it was just an example of something that I've been increasingly kind of noticing, that there was this certain kind of frequency profile. I mean, well, one thing you pointed out when we were speaking before this live stream is that on the whole, there's been this kind of it generally sounds fairly nice if you have this kind of broad bass to treble roll off to your mix in terms of the energy of the mix. And that's something I noticed all the way back in the 90s when people were mastering things then. and when I was comparing things against mixers then. But increasingly, what I've noticed is that there's a kind of a dip in that frequency response around the like 100, 150 hertz kind of zone, and around the 3 to 6 kilohertz area. And I'm not sure that it's a coincidence that lines up with bits of the spectrum that, because of the kind of K-weighting curve within the loudness spec, this kind of pre-emphasis that the loudness detection applies to your audio before measuring its kind of averaged signal level. I don't think it's any accident that those cuts come at the bits of that frequency response that, in a sense, are most expensive in terms of loudness. Just after you've just after the low cut, as you're going up the spectrum, and just after the high boost, then around 4K.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting idea that I hadn't had before. I mean, you're right. We'll just give a little bit of context if people haven't come across this before. So all of the streaming services are using LUFS, loudness units full scale, to assess the loudness of songs and turn down the loudest ones. And some of them turn up the quieter stuff as well. LUFS is basically the same as RMS, which is basically the same as what an old-fashioned VU meter used to show. But RMS is less sensitive than our ears are to bass, I would say. In other words, you can have, if you have an RMS meter and you put in what I consider to be a good sound amount of low end, the RMS meter will read very high. So I said that backwards before, didn't I? It's more sensitive than our ears are, even though it sounds fine. So, and this is because
it was also always the thing with the VU meters on tape machines. You couldn't set your hi-hat level going to tape to be at 0 dB VU, because otherwise you'd be overloading the tape. It wasn't reading all the information that was there.
Right.
So just wasn't reacting to it.
Exactly. Those meters, there's a certain amount of, with the VU meter, there's frequency dependence, and it's too complicated to explain entirely by words. But the point of LUFS is it's an attempt to improve on that. And to do that, they apply this filter. So it's the red curve that you can see in the graph that we've put up. So basically, it measures the RMS of the audio, but it ignores everything from roughly 80 hertz downwards, because it's filtered out, and it pays more attention to, as you say, things from kind of 2K up. I think that the middle of that graph is about 2K, and it's kind of extends from 1 kilohertz up to 3 or 4 kilohertz. So this is the K-weighting that is applied to the RMS value in order to come up with the LUFS loudness. That is, like I say, I feel it's better than either RMS or VU. I still like using VU meters personally, but it gives something that agrees better with what I hear in terms of deciding how loud something is.
And it's interesting because
which was the goal.
I think we're going to be talking a lot about kind of potential loopholes and stuff like this, but on the whole, the system works really well, given actually how straightforward its design is. On the whole,
absolutely.
In terms of general loudness matching, so you don't have to reach for your volume control. I mean, the stuff we're kind of talking about here is stuff that people are trying to do to game a half a dB or a dB here and there if they can.
Yes, I mean, well, if you're right, because it's interesting, because if what you're saying is, your idea is that whenever it was, maybe 5+ years ago, like maybe 10 years, whenever it was, that certainly normalization has become a real factor in the last 5 years. People have been aware that if they make something really loud, it will be reduced in level when they hear it online, and that therefore they are treating the stuff that they're supplying to streaming services in a way to try and work against that, to get it sound as loud as possible, despite that effect. So it's an interesting theory.
It's necessarily a specific thing for streaming services. I think they're just doing it to their mixes in general, because they don't know what's going to end up on a streaming service. Is my kind of sense of it. I mean, I a lot of the stuff that I review for Mix Review, I actually get off iTunes or Cobuz or whatever. So it's not a streamed file as such. But yeah.
Well, I mean, what I was going to say is that my impression is actually people are not really paying any attention to that at all. I mean, some people are, but there's very much a split out there amongst mastering engineers. Certainly, there are some who just like, no, I just do what I do, and streaming services, it'll be what it'll be. And then there are other people who are paying more attention. And, I mean, I don't personally make adjustments specifically for the streaming services. What I find is that the adjustments I tend to make for musical reasons actually end up working well on the streaming platforms.
I mean,
And
funnily
that's
enough,
something.
I wonder whether a lot of this stuff is actually happening earlier than the mastering. I get the sense that music is now starting to be designed for the medium, so to speak, in the way, in a sense, it has been forever. I mean, there was a big rise in the use of distortion, for example, when we were peak normalizing, to allow people to get away with clipping the hell out of their mixes. The noisier a mix sounds, the more that it hides the art. I mean, a classic example of that is Imagine Dragons Radioactive, which is absolutely covered in the arrangement with a whole bunch of digital sounding distortion, so they can slam it up against the end stops and you kind of don't notice as much because there's so much distortion there anyway. It's kind of hiding in plain view. And I think, I noticed this, for example, I mean, this is another area of it, but in the shortness of kick drums, or the fact that people are in general now putting a lot more really low sub on mixes, because they know they can get away with it. It makes their mix sound bassy, whatever, and it'll still sound not much quieter than on the streaming platforms. So I think I can imagine that mastering engineers may be doing it, but I can also imagine that actually producers who are mixing the stuff and who are creating the stuff are realizing that actually we can deal with this stuff earlier on, and they're just choosing sounds and choosing arrangements and choosing. I think it's beginning to affect the music.
Well, it's an interesting kind of chicken and egg kind of situation, isn't it? Because to use the Imagine Dragons, I've noticed something similar, which is that there's a lot of saturation and a lot of distortion coming out these days. But I wonder whether it's because of the mastering practices at the height of the loudness war that became part of the sound. So people listening to music at those times are more inspired or more inclined to go for. I mean, certainly that's something that I've heard feedback from other mastering engineers, is that they do what they consider to be a great master, and the client says, "Oh, can we just have a bit? Can you just push it a bit?" So they do, to the point where they're like, "Well, there you go. Look, that's what you get." And the client goes, "Yeah, that," because
and actually,
they're emulating.
I'll tell you where I noticed this. I mean, I completely agree with you on all the kind of the rock music, the distorted kind of electro stuff. But I also really noticed it. I mean, one of the first places I noticed it was actually on hip hop kick drums. That part of the sound of like 2001, a classic kind of hip hop drum sound, is the fact of them hitting the end stop of the digital medium with the kick drum, and so you get this kind of burst of distortion along with every kick drum hit that gives it a different sound. That's basically what it is. It changes the tone. And interestingly, I've seen multiple situations of releases then that come out where you can see that this has clearly been done as part of the mix or part of some master or whatever, and then the mastering engineer has high pass filtered it, or there's some kind of high pass filtering in the chain, and you get that kind of slightly slanty flat top on the kick drum hits. Or they might, and the thing is, they might clip it again, so you get this kind of angle like this. This kind of goes flat and then goes into the end stop again. And I think it's because, I mean, you certainly can hear this in hip hop sample libraries. There will be clipped kick drums in there because people have got used to that, because that's the way they effectively mastered it.
Mm. Yeah, no, absolutely. The whole thing kind of feeds around on itself. And I think, honestly, it's one of the things that I don't like about the loudness war sound, is, clipping distortion in very small amounts can be very, very transparent. You just literally won't hear it. But once you start pushing it to extreme levels, it has quite a characteristic sound, because it doesn't react in the way that, a limiter reacts to the audio signal. Whereas clipping just clips. And it gives what I kind of feel is this kind of very flat, kind of lifeless feel to things. And then when you add into that the fact that it gets converted to an MP3 file or an AAC file, and that will have extra peaks that then get clipped again. And it was super loud to begin with. I mean, just to circle back to something you said right at the beginning of this conversation, I mean, it's really good to hear that you are not being pressured to deliver super hot mixes, because I'm hearing from a lot of mastering engineers that they are getting, somebody told me yesterday they had a mix supplied that was at -5 LUFS. That's a mix. That's almost as loud as Death Magnetic was after it was mastered. And we know that before, that went up like 10 dBs or so in the mastering process. So, and that's a scary concept. I hear that a lot. I mean, Bob Ludwig has told me that, there's lots of mastering engineers kind of going, hold on, it's not us. And
yeah, oh yeah,
and there's
yeah,
kind
yeah,
of, there's different factors in that. I mean, one of the things that you talk to mixers and they will say, well, yeah, absolutely, because I supplied this beautiful mix and the mastering engineer smashed it. So if somebody's going to
yeah.
smash it, it's going to be me, so I can smash it in the way that
Yes.
I want
Well,
to.
I mean, this has been a big refrain, certainly amongst mix engineers, is that they can't afford. I mean, they're on several levels. And this is one of the interesting things about this is that we focus so much on the consumer side of things, of making it that the consumer is not going to be affected by loudness bias, and it seems very little attention has been given to removing loudness bias from the production process. In fact, there's a really good example of this. The Taylor's version of All Too Well that I looked at them for the mix review. I compared it to the original version, but loudness matched it. And the new version is mastered louder than the old version. But if you loudness match it, I don't think it sounds as good. I think they basically did a Taylor's version, and whoever it was, I mean, the thing is, I can see it. I can see how it went. You know, he had the old version there. He'd done a new production. He put them side by side and thought, "Oh my God, this doesn't sound as good." And so he kind of thought, well, you know, if I send Taylor or a management an MP3 where I've cheekily snuck the loudness up a couple of dB, they're never going to loudness match it. So irrespective of the fact that a worse sounding mix was put out and no one challenged it, or the reason why I can imagine that happening is because in the production process there was no loudness matching going on as a matter of course. And I think this is where a lot of stuff comes from. Certainly, where a lot of mixing engineers are doing it. They think, okay, I have no idea where this thing's going to be heard or under what conditions. And you know, a client can say anything. They can say, "Oh no, I'm going to loudness match it," and then they send it to their manager who doesn't, or they send it to someone else. You have no control over it. So when you're sending out an approval version of a mix, you've got to kind of not exactly master it, but think, okay, I can't afford for this thing that potentially my income is based on to be judged unfairly in situations beyond my control. And so this is where you get into this strange, I mean, I think maybe part of the reason why I've never had an issue with loudness from a client pushing for it. No, actually, I have once, but that's many years ago. But why I don't really get an issue is that I do take a view on it. You know, when I find out what they're going against in terms of the stuff they're referencing, or you know, if they haven't given me specific references, you know, I take a view about this is, I think, what they're going to be competing with. I try to make sure it's a kind of a comparable loudness with the stuff that they're competing against, so it doesn't become an issue. But
then
I think if you were just mixing, I can imagine you coming into this issue quite a lot. That you'll basically get mix notes back that say, "Oh, well, it sounds a bit limp and not very good compared to the other stuff I'm putting it up against."
I think that's definitely a case, and I understand that from a mixer's perspective. My concern is that in lots of cases, it's pretty straightforward processing that's being used to achieve that. I don't know what process you use, but
oh yes, yeah.
For example, just whack an L1 on it.
I deliberately try and do stuff that is going to make a minimal. I mean, the only thing I'd ever do is limiting and clipping. Basically, the only thing I'd ever do.
Yeah.
You know, it's not. I'm not chucking it through multiband or any strange kind of psychoacoustic process, all this kind of stuff, because apart from I think that's not my wheelhouse. You know, there are people like yourself who've spent decades learning how to do that stuff properly and to make a proper decision in terms of a mastering context. But and from my perspective, I want it to be that when they send the actual mix file that doesn't have that stuff on it off to a mastering engineer, I'm not sending the mastering engineer fundamentally something different than I sent to the client.
Yeah,
they have an accurate way to judge whether my mix is any good.
That's a great point, though, that I wanted to pick out, which is that you're doing the right thing, which is to send the unlimited file for mastering. I'm not sure these days that is necessarily happening as much as it should. I think in lots of cases, I mean, I'm also imagining you don't push stuff super loud when you're doing.
I try not to normally
in that process, because
but we're all pragmatists. We're all pragmatists, you know.
Well,
there come times when someone comes to you with something and all their references are massively smashed into the end stops. It's like, okay, if that's what you're going to do to it, I need you to know that how my mix is going to respond under those circumstances. In fact, I'm thinking specifically of this example years ago, where the most I've ever smashed a mix and worked to make a mix just loud before the loudness normalization came in was exactly that kind of situation. All the references were absolutely hammered into the M stop. I mean, it's like that Skrillex reference we both have, the Bangarang. It is so loud. It's almost impossibly loud to achieve that. I mean, I still don't quite know how they made it that loud.
Well, I mean, to pick up on the more general point, though, I mean, you were saying it's because people are not loudness matching as part of the production process.
Yes.
And I think I would broaden that even more, because so I've been told, and nobody has ever told me that I'm wrong. It was off the record, but apparently only 17% of people on Spotify change the default normalization settings in any way, which means that 83% of people using Spotify are listening with normalization enabled, and the level is -14 currently.
Yeah.
However, I put up a survey in a couple of Facebook groups, production groups that I'm part of, and said, how many people here disable normalization? And it were 75% of people,
of professionals. Very interesting.
Of professionals, well, and amateurs, just people making music. So right. For me, there's this really cruel irony in the sense that the people who care most about the music, which is us, are doing something that most other people in the world don't do when they listen to the music, namely disabling loudness normalization. So we all obsess constantly about loudness, too loud, not loud enough, all the rest of it. And actually, again, like just as people don't really care on Beatport or SoundCloud that there are huge differences in loudness, end listeners are not hearing them that way. Most people are hearing them because the other statistic I have is that there are 4 times as many people listening to music on YouTube, where everything is normalized, than there are on all the other music streaming services put together. And I don't know how that translates in terms of streams. You can say that probably if you pay for a music subscription service, you stream a lot more music than people on YouTube. But just in raw user numbers, 80% of people are listening, or of users are on YouTube, where everything is normalized. So for me, the loudness match comparison is the most important one. Whereas I think most people in music production think that the unnormalized version is the most important one, because they've changed something about, and unfortunately that leads to this position where, yes, people are comparing a mix without normalizing, without loudness matching, with somebody else's master, feeling like it lacks, going back to you, or you being a pragmatist have already made that adjustment because that's what they're going to say. And they end up falling in love with a version that is actually pushed harder and possibly in a different way than the mastering engineer would eventually recommend. So and the key, of course, so now let's come up with some solutions, because I was chatting to Mike Exeter, who I saw when I had my glasses on, is in the chat here, who's fantastic UK producer, about exactly this. And he said, thank you for making the loudness penalty website, because it enabled him to have this conversation with a client just recently, and persuade them, because they took the 2 versions, listened to it there at matched loudness, and realized, oh, you're right, so that's great to hear, because I get quite a lot of kickback from the mastering community about the fact that I called it loudness penalty, and they're saying it's not a penalty. And that's what I'm going to be talking about, by the way, for anybody who's interested in the next live stream at 3:00, because it's a little bit more complicated than that. I mean, I think we can wrap this up soon and have a look at the questions. But the other interesting thing you said was that you think people are mastering for the format, namely for streaming services,
or mixing.
I'm not convinced that that's true, but I kind of wish that they would, because in the final live stream today, I'm going to be talking about what we can learn about dynamics by looking at vinyl. And I'm going to be using this amazing new plugin by Tokyo Dawn Labs called Simulathe, which is an emulation of a vinyl lathe. So you can tell it, this is side A, this is side B, here are the tracks. You can vary all the parameters as you would in an actual lathe, and listen to an emulated version of it afterwards with the clicks and the crackle and all the rest of it added in. I mean, there's even a microscope where you can zoom in and look at the groove on the record. It's quite amazing. And you can play with it for free if anybody wants to try that. The thing that surprised me, I've always known that you couldn't cut vinyl as loud as we master CDs, but I had never realized until I tried. I'd never realized the extent, when I got my final settings of managing to fit the entire album onto the vinyl and got the groove width and the excursion and everything right. And I looked at the gain adjustment that I had made from my own not super loud, quite conservative master, and I was like, whoa. I mean, when I send things out for vinyl mastering these days, I remove the final limiter and I reduce the level by 6 dB. And I've always been slightly cautious, thinking, have I overdone that? Are we going to end up with vinyl that's not as loud as it could have been because I haven't, and now I know, no, that's absolutely, and I could go even further. So I'm going to try and show that in the final live stream today, if anybody is interested. But what it makes me feel is, yes, back in the day when people were mastering for vinyl, there was no point in limiting stuff as hard as we do these days, because
although I don't know, I'd push back against that, because there was that whole thing with the Beatles, wasn't it? That basically they couldn't work out why their records sounded so quiet compared to the Americans, and realized that they needed to limit their masters. And the Beatles were kind of pioneers in terms of pushing their stuff loud on vinyl.
Well, yes and no. They used compression on Paul's bass, but compression is very different
on the master itself. I thought they actually compressed it during the mastering stage itself. I mean, this is entirely just kind of vague memory. I think they did. But I push back against the whole idea that Loudness Wars is entirely a digital thing. I think it's always been a thing. It's just that the things that made things loud in the different formats changed over time. And the things that you did on vinyl to make it not skip out of the groove were different than the things that you did when you were trying to make something peak loud, and are the different to the things that you now do to try and make things loud on the streaming services. I mean, bass is a classic example. You couldn't afford to have masses of bass on your record when you were pushing it into the end stops on a CD, because it would distort. Whereas you can have that now, you just can't have as much 120 hertz or whatever. And you see the frequency profiles change. I mean, in the 90s, pushing 100 hertz was a good idea, because then you didn't have to push 40 hertz, and you didn't really push 40 hertz, because if you did, you couldn't run it as loud on the mastering because it took too much headroom, too much peak headroom. And so, and I don't know, I think every time we do a new format and a new way of doing it, it affects, people are always going to try and push it. I think the great thing now is that the side effects of people trying to hack the format are comparatively benign. I mean, you're getting some slightly weird tonal profiles on some mixes, but on the whole, the idea of people having a short, tight kick drums and lots of like sub frequencies, well, I quite like both of those, so I'm not going to complain about it. It's a lot better than distortion and no bass.
So, well, I agree with you about that. I mean, I think you're right. The Loudness War on vinyl was different than the loud. I was talking specifically about limiting. It's
right.
And I think they did different stuff then to try and get loud vinyl, and they're doing different stuff now to try and get loud CDs. Where we completely agree is, yes, I think if people started paying more attention to normalization, realizing that they could ease back on the peak levels, didn't have to, crush all these super loud masters, and you've got more freedom with the EQ, to be honest, we would just, things would improve. And so I kind of don't see as much of that as I would like. There's people out there kind of hating normalization and feeling like it messes with their ability to achieve what they want to creatively. And I feel like the opposite is true, that it
is totally the opposite. Yeah.
It actually means,
to a certain extent, I mean, I think the thing that always drove the Loudness War for me with CD was basically fear. People were afraid that if they didn't do stuff maxed out, that their mixes would suffer in some context. And I think nowadays, the fact is that there's a competing fear. And the competing fear is that increasingly people are listening to things under loudness normalized situations where your mix could actually sound really bad compared to the competition, where previously there wasn't that concern as much. And so it's like the fear of it being heard in a situation where there isn't loudness normalizing is still there, and certainly much more in the production process than the listening thing. But you've got this competing fear. And I think in a sense saying, well, actually, you're going to make your stuff sound uncompetitive in the situation where most people are listening to it is, I find, a compelling argument. It's certainly the reason why I now spend time doing loudness normalized comparisons and stuff, because that's actually a compelling fear that, and certainly as time develops and, loudness normalization routines may improve and whatever else. And, you suddenly find that your mix blows up and then they're starting to play it in cinemas or whatever, and it sounds really horrible and it could sound really good. And yeah, so I think there is an element of fear there, and it's nice that fear is there, because I think, you've got to have reasons to drive people to make stuff that actually, in the end, is going to sound better. I mean, the loudness normalized, if you're working within a situation where you have a bit of that fear, you're not going to push your mixes as hard as you would have before loudness normalization exists, and that can only be a good thing.
It's interesting. I mean, I agree with you. I shy away from I did a blog post years ago talking about loudness FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt.
Right.
And made this point that I figured out there were 7 points in the production process, from the songwriter right through to the A&R guy and the publicist. And the point I was making is that if any person in that sequence of 7 stages starts to worry, oh, maybe this should be louder, as soon as you put that doubt and uncertainty in people's, it's the same strategy that people used to kind of try and disprove the risks of smoking back in the day. They were like, oh, where's the scientific proof that smoking causes cancer? And at that stage, they didn't have any. So you get people questioning it, and then you can get away with. So the same thing happens with the production process. People get concerned, and then, oh, well, we'll make it loud to be on the safe side. So it requires everybody in that 7 steps to be confident that they can get a great result without having to push the loudness high, and that's hard to achieve. But
I think the point is, I think the loudness normalization is making that easier. It's making it an easier argument now, because
I would hope that people are ignoring it.
It's a little bit of a head in the sand thing, I think.
Yeah, well, that's the thing that I'm going to talk about at 3:00 in the next live stream, 3:00 UK time. But go to dynamicrangeday.com and click live to find the time wherever you are. Just click through on YouTube and it'll give you a countdown. And don't forget, if you're enjoying this conversation, please share it with everybody else so that they can also enjoy it. Like, follow, and subscribe. Smash that like button.
Corner somewhere if there's a corner.
That's it. The people kind of go, yeah, I know all about normalization, but if I make it super loud, it's going to work anyway. And I think the other thing is, I don't like talking about fear because people don't like being told that they're afraid of stuff. It's not a persuasive argument for me to go out into the world and say, oh, loudness war is driven by fear, because there's a bunch of macho sound engineers out there who are like, don't tell me I'm not afraid of anything. Maybe that's why it's not catching on, or maybe it's just because we've got our strategies, they've been successful for 10 or 15 years, and you don't want to change the way that you work. I think lots of people don't want to admit that things are changing and that there is now a more successful approach to doing this stuff. But for me,
in a sense, you can see that in the time it took for people to get into the loudness wars from the invention of CD. It took people a while to kind of cotton on and go, oh, I can do. I don't need to do things the way they were. There's always going to be this inertia. But interestingly, this is something you mentioned to me the other day, that there's apparently some kind of service online where you can stream stuff to clients. You can provide stuff to clients, and it's all loud. All the comparisons are loudness normalized, and there's version history and stuff.
That's what I was going to suggest. So solutions for this, for people watching, ways to figure this out. First of all, there's my website, loudnesspenalty.com. You may hate the name, but all it does is it doesn't even upload the music. It just measures the music you're working on, and it will play everything at the loudness distribution level of whichever service you're interested in. So Spotify, YouTube. I mean, to be honest, most of them these days are the same. So, and the important thing is not exactly how loud they are, it's just that you match them. It's a really quick and easy way to hear, oh, how does my thing compare with Imagine Dragons or Metallica or Taylor Swift or whatever it is that your a reference track might be. There's also a new site called Samply.app. Sample as in sample, but with an Y on the end, .app. So it's basically a file sharing service. They give lossless streaming, so you can upload mix refs and things and stream them to clients losslessly, if that's or there are lower bit rates for if they're listening on mobile or wherever. You can do versions of songs. So it's really nice for supplying mix references, because they can leave comments that are time stamped. You can flick between. I'm not sponsored by Samply, but the really good thing is that they have loudness matching built in. So you can just go to the preferences, enable it, and then, I mean, just for example, you do a mix and they ask for some revisions, and you do the revisions. Ideally, we would all then loudness match that with the previous mix and send it back. But, life's too short. The great thing about Samply is it will stack up those different versions. They can flick between mix 1, mix 2, mix 3. They're all loudness matched if that's what they would like. They can leave comments. Hopefully things like that will start to help. because
Yeah.
as we say, it builds it. I think
that's what
actually
it needs.
it's a great conversation we're having.
Just comparison speaks for itself. You put something of yours against something that's in the market and is nice, sounds good, and it becomes immediately obvious.
Yeah, that's right. But it also, as you were saying, it takes out it moves that decision back into the production process.
And it needs to.
It needs to be there, yeah, because in lots of ways, well, mastering is often too late. If you get a mix that is -5 and everybody has already signed off on it, you've got nowhere else to go. They're not going to accept a master that's any quieter than -5, or probably won't accept a master that's any quieter.
Or indeed, if you get a file to master that's already clipped, then it's like nothing you can do with that.
Yep,
and
absolutely.
It's clear that there are plenty of commercial releases where it's clear that something like that has happened.
So yeah, I mean, it's good because I'm always optimistic. I've been optimistic for the whole 12 years that I've been running Dynamic Range Day, and it's still here and we still need it. So maybe that optimism is guided.
But as I said at the beginning, I mean, to kind of bring it full circle, as I said at the beginning, the fact that this has been happening every year continues to shine a light on things. If it hadn't been for this kind of thing, I wouldn't even be doing any of the loudness checking and what's it that I'm doing. And this information is getting out. I am getting discussions from people after I've mixed stuff where they're saying, oh, what loudness should I master stuff at in terms of LUFS? And how's that going to play on the streaming platform? It's a discussion now where it just wasn't a discussion before.
Yep.
Amongst musicians,
I agree. And thank you for the kind words. Let's hope we start to see some less. Let's hope people continue to talk about it and also start changing the way that they deal with it in a positive way. I'm just looking through the comments here just to see. It's great to see so many people here and involved. I was looking to see if there are any questions. There was one comment that I noticed where someone was saying that LUFS is a broadcast speech standard that's completely useless for music, and people need to forget it as it tells them you absolutely nothing about how loud your record actually sounds at the point of delivery. And I'm sorry, Aidan, but I can't agree. I do agree that nobody should aim for...
I'm against that too. I agree with you.
Nobody
we're both
should,
on the same page.
Nobody should aim for LUFS numbers, right? It's not like you can say, oh, you should be mastering at this, that, or the other. I summed it up in a Facebook post I made a while ago, and I'm probably going to do a video that kind of digs into it in more detail. For me, LUFS is the result, not the goal, right? So you do whatever is musically right, but then you have to check the LUFS, as we've been saying, to understand how it's going to be played back, because most places it's going to be normalized. And regardless of, yes, it was developed as a speech standard for broadcast, but actually it is reasonably effective, remarkably effective, given how simple it is for music as well. And like it or not, that's what's being used almost everywhere these days. So for us as mixers, but also as mastering engineers, in order to understand what's going to happen at the end of the chain, you need to then measure the loudness and go, okay, so everything's going to be played at -14 or -16, whatever it is. How does my music sound in that context? And hopefully it'll sound great, and then you just say, okay, job done. But if there are any reservations or concerns, that's your opportunity to deal with that. The big problem is you think it sounds amazing and then you hear it on Spotify or wherever and suddenly it doesn't for some reason. That's what you don't want. And this is an opportunity using LUFS to check this stuff to improve that situation and to not even hack the system, but just understand it. And, in the same way that you get a test pressing for vinyl, it just makes sense. So let's have a look at any of the other comments. Oh, so Martin asked, would Depeche Mode's Memento Mori have sounded better if it was more dynamic? Which is an interesting question. This is a comment that came up in my Facebook group, and it's mastered loud. It's not extraordinarily loud, but it's up there. I think it's kind of -7, -8 LUFS typically.
Okay.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say probably not, because it was mastered by Matt Colton, who won the Dynamic Range Day Award some years ago now for an album that he did. I mean, he understands all of this stuff intimately. I suspect it was mixed very loud. And he replied to the comment saying it sounds exactly the way everybody wanted it to. I don't.
Yeah, well, I mean that's
I
always
listened
the
to it.
bottom line, isn't it?
I listened to it, and I would love to hear a more dynamic version to be able to do that comparison. But I suspect that Matt will have made aesthetic decisions to make sure that any downside to the loudness was minimized. And of course, that's true for the majority. You know, everybody who's making these loud masters. I mean, the one great thing I will say is that when I started Dynamic Range Day 2010, I think that was the peak of the loudness wars. There was a mass of stuff coming out super loud and sounding horrendous because of it. There is still stuff that is super loud and not sounding great around at the moment, of course. There's also a lot of stuff that's much more dynamic and sounding great, which is nice to see. The majority is louder than I consider it needs to be. But I guess what I'm saying is the average, I feel, has reduced somewhat. And that's what
right.
that's what I would like to see, is a kind of general drift downwards as people experiment more and more. Like one of the nominees for
there's a lot of grounds to be optimistic about that too. I mean, the same way that it took a while for CDs to get loud after they were introduced, I think the more things become loudness normalized and the more this discussion continues, I think we will see things, because the advantage, the musical advantages, once everyone's kind of realized this issue, are fairly obviously apparent for most styles of music. I mean, there is the occasional mix that if you'd basically have to mix it different if you weren't going to drive it that loud. You know, you'd have to mix the drums less loud, because the moment you're not clipping and limiting them into oblivion, they'd be out of balance. They'd be too loud. And, you know, it is, contrary to popular opinion, it is actually possible to have drums that are too loud.
Absolutely. Well, it's possible to have music that is too dynamic. You know, I mean, another message or way in which I get misunderstood is this idea that I'm completely anti-compression and limiting, and couldn't be further from the truth. I use them all the time, every day in my job. You know, it's all about, as I keep saying, finding that sweet spot where it's loud enough but not too loud. So yeah, no, I agree. I think there are rooms to be optimistic. I mean, I was going to say one of the nominees for the Dynamic Range Day Award this year is the latest Taylor Swift album. It's right on the borderline. The album overall is -10 LUFS, so it has some tracks that push up louder than I think they need to be, and it's quite a mellow, chilled out album. So given that it's mellow and chilled out, it's still pretty loud. So it's not like I'm holding it up as some beacon, but I definitely think, you know, it's a reason to be optimistic, is that we are seeing more and more examples of things that are not pushed right to the max. Because as you say, the Taylor's version stuff is, you know, way up there.
Yeah.
A lot of it, unfortunately. Somebody says, can you spell out the music sharing website you just mentioned? Yes, so it's SAMPLY samply.app, A-P-P. In fact, I could post that in the comments. Anybody who wants to just click the link, hopefully that should come up there. There's a question from DM. Do you think the lack of low mids, toms and bass in some genres makes music be perceived as louder? I think having lots of bass in toms and stuff is a way of making something sound loud, because you can have them pop out of the mix at you. It's definitely a strategy if you want very high loudness in terms of measured loudness.
Yeah,
it's very difficult to have lots of bass. One of the first things that will happen is, you mentioned it, that low pass filter to get rid of all the sub bass, because that's the stuff that has the most energy and will distort the fastest. So I don't think it makes things sound loud, because here's another point, right? There's a big difference between something that sounds loud and something that measures loud. I think it's reducing the amount of bass is important if you want things to measure loud, but I'm not sure that would have the final result, especially when you loud.
It's also under what circumstances you're talking about loud. I mean, in peak normalized, the kind of loudness war era, you didn't want bass because it used a lot of headroom, and therefore you couldn't push things into the end stops as much without distortion. In the loudness normalized situation, stuff below 80 hertz is high pass filtered out of the detector circuit, so you can get away with having a lot more of that stuff than you used to be able to without dramatically affecting the loudness rating that's given under the loudness normalized system. But yes, that kind of 100 to 150 hertz zone is probably the most expensive area of your frequency spectrum in terms of how the LUFS kind of routine detects the loudness of the mix. So yes, in that respect, if I were wanting to make sure that the thing wasn't penalized in terms of its LUFS value, that's probably something that I would at least be judicious with. I'd be careful not to just, I mean, it's a bit of a battleground in a lot of mixes anyway, to be frank, but that's an area where I would be inclined to be quite careful what instruments I give that region to, and how much energy I give to them.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I would also say they're super important and super valuable. It's, as always, all of this stuff is about balance. I mean, this is the other great thing. I mean, I'm currently, this is slightly off our topic today, but I've recently put out some videos looking at whether or not intersample peaks are audible, and when they might be audible, and whether or not true peak limiters sound better or worse than normal limiters. I'm not going to go into that rabbit hole at all, except to say that there was some very intense debate on Gearspace about these videos and whether or not they were accurate. I'm thinking of doing a follow-up video where I dive into some of these details because they're quite interesting. But the position I keep coming back to is that it's not an issue if you don't try and push stuff too hard. For me,
that's the thing.
It's
only when you're pushing to the extremes that any of the stuff matters.
Exactly. So, I mean, because there's another thing about bass on vinyl, and another thing playing around with the lathe emulation can show you, and the vinyl cutting engineers tell me it's a myth that you can't have bass. It's even a myth that you can't have stereo bass on vinyl. You have to be careful with it. You have to manage it carefully, and it's a valuable commodity. But you can do all of this stuff, and it gets easier the more balanced your approach is. Not super dynamic, not super crushed, but in that sweet spot. All of these problems go away. I don't think about any of this stuff when I'm mastering. I just make stuff sound good, check it at the end, and go, yeah, I'm good to go. For streaming and for, my masters are equally suitable for vinyl or for streaming.
So in a sense, actually, I see that in the kind of project studio space as well, is that some of the most crushed things that I see is stuff that hasn't been that well mixed. And so therefore they've tried to drive it loud to make it sound as good as the other stuff they're comparing to under non-loudness normalized conditions.
Yeah, which is something that phrase Bob Katz coined, the loudness potential of a mix. It's
all right. Yes, I can see that.
If you start with it as a goal from the beginning and it's built all the way through, it gets much easier at the final stage to achieve the end result. Whereas if, as an extreme example, if nobody uses any compression or limiting early in the production process, it's very, very hard to apply enough in the mastering stage and still have it sound reasonable to achieve high loudness. So yeah, I think, let's wrap this up by emphasizing, normalization gives us more creative freedom. The balanced approach, I find, is the most successful, not pushing it super loud, but making it loud enough. And that'll probably do. Any final words from you, Mike?
No, I mean, I just think broadly it's a good thing. And I think I don't think enough mixing engineers at the moment, and certainly enough kind of project studio, home studio musicians, I don't think they've always not done enough mix referencing on the whole, comparing their stuff against commercial releases. But now, increasingly, I'm finding myself banging the drum for, actually, you need to do this with loudness normalization as well. Otherwise, you're really not getting a suitable picture of what you're doing. Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's kind of what my message really is boiling down to as well. I think we're both singing from exactly the same hymn sheet. It's one of the things that I was taught to do first as a mastering engineer. And it's one of the most powerful strategies I have. I developed the Perception plugin. That's all it does is match loudness. And it's incredibly, it doesn't really make any sense, but I always think of it as being like a microscope for your mix. And, you have two things and they're slightly different loudness, and you listen to them and you think, oh, maybe this, maybe that, maybe the other. Then you loudness match them, and suddenly you can go, oh, yeah, right. That's not, it makes everything. Yeah. Well, it's almost like focus, isn't it? It's almost like it's out of focus when the loudness isn't matched.
Yeah, exactly. So it's an incredibly powerful technique, and I really encourage everybody to dig into it if it's something you haven't tried before. So thank you, Mike, for joining me and for the interesting conversation.
Pleasure, as always.
Thanks to everybody who's watching the stream and commenting in the chat. I'll go back through the chat and just see if there's any other questions we haven't answered yet. If you enjoyed this, please share it on social media, wherever it is you found it, so that other people can help find it. And head over to dynamicrangeday.com, click on the live menu item at the top of the screen to find when the other live streams are through the day. I'll be doing one at 3 p.m. UK time, and then the main live stream with the announcement of the Dynamic Range Day award winner will be at 10 p.m. UK time this evening. Head over and find us on Facebook. Like, follow, and subscribe. And as always, thanks for listening.